Surrealists, obviously, but also about what I call the politics of eros. And what I'm largely doing in this lecture, with a view to, if you like, introducing Surrealism and its central tenet of desire and eros to those of you who aren't perhaps very familiar with it, but also to nuancing that to those of you who have already come across it. My idea is to sort of walk you through some examples of male Surrealist art, and then look at one or two prominent women Surrealists, all of whom feature in the show, as I say, on the third upstairs. So the theme of eros is something I'll explain, and essentially what I want you to keep in mind during the next hour or so is the theme of desire. So while it's a bit early in the day for some of us to contemplate all things desirous, that is, as I say, very much the mood of the talk. Repassionner la vie is the ultimatum that André Breton, the leader of the Surrealist movement, urged in his 1944 essay called Lumière Noire, which is published during his wartime exile in the United States. Repassionner la vie, inflame life with passion. This was the call to arms for the Surrealists, even in the midst of the horrendous events of World War II. From the first Surrealist manifesto, issued in 1924 in Paris, where the movement was born, to its official end in 1969, as announced in the newspaper Le Monde, again in Paris, passion, desire, eroticism, and what they called mad love, amour fou, was the aim, agenda, and most importantly, the revolutionary spirit of Surrealism. Hence, one of the first things they did was not just to write poems or paint canvases, but also to issue flyers and put out posters around the streets of Paris, which said such bizarre things as, si vous aimez l'amour, vous aimerez le surréalisme. If you love, you love surrealism. A kind of conundrum to a large extent to members of the public, but very much the kind of, if you like, challenge, which, as I say, was at the kernel of the Surrealist enterprise, in art, but also in life. And with Surrealism, we're always talking about something that went way beyond a style, way beyond a movement in art, something which was about a philosophy of living, one which, as I say, embraced love and desire in its good, bad, and often very lustful dimensions. Spanning this epic period then, from 1924 right up until 1969 in its history, Surrealism is an art movement which dominated the first half of the 20th century. It was born out of the ashes of Dada and World War I. It survived, most importantly, World War II, both when it was repressed in Europe, in France under the Vichy regime, under the Nazi regime in Germany, when it headed down south to be involved in the resistance in the southern shores of France, and when it survived in exile in New York, largely in the United States, during the war years, influencing artists there. Surrealism managed to not just survive, but actually influence generation after generation of young artists who flocked to it and embraced its international spirit. Surrealism even influenced the spirit and the events of May 1968. Surrealism's aim was to fuse the real and what it called the surreal. Largely, it was to fuse the conscious and the unconscious mind, the conscious and the unconscious world. The Surrealists sought to overthrow bourgeois good taste, bourgeois morality, through their assault on the fine art tradition, on fine art technique, and most importantly, on fine art and bourgeois values. How? Well, as I say, through this weapon of erotic desire. And their approach to desire was multifaceted. It varied from artist to artist, and if anything, the one thing that all art historians of Surrealism can agree on is that there is no one Surrealist style. That's part of its energy, part of its dynamism, but also perhaps why it's only when we have major exhibitions that we realize just how many people were actually involved in Surrealism, and how many of them, if you like, disagreed and yet all shared this common revolutionary spirit. Here on the left, you've Juan Miro's Love of 1925, Amour, and on the right, René Magritte's Lovers of 1928. And I show this to you just to give you an idea of the kind of radical difference in the first decade of Surrealism when it came to the style of the movement. Here on the left, as I say, Miro has this childlike naivety, this automatic technique, this idea of taking your pencil for a line, which people do in kindergarten. He spelt out amour, dotting it almost in a mockery of pointillism, but also in a very infantile, naive manner. And the essence, of course, is this idea of opposites attracting, male and female attracting in this throbbing heart-like image. This amoebic image is an example of what we call automatic surrealism, that abstract surrealist style. And it stands at odds, if you like, to the René Magritte, which you see on the right in 1928, which is captured, where the same theme of love and desire is captured in a very, very different style, a style of hard-edge illusionism, where it's almost got a photographic realism about it. But of course, as you can see, you still have this strange approach to desire. You're not getting a traditional image of lovers, as you might get from mythological subject matters in the 19th century. Instead, you're getting an image of two lovers kissing and swaddled, smothered, indeed, in a sheet which might represent the bed, a sheet which might represent incestuous or forbidden or clandestine relationships, a sheet which again introduces an element of threat and taboo to the subject matter of desire. And this is again important when we keep in mind how the Surrealists use the theme of desire in particular to shock you, to make you think twice about art, to make you question what you actually see, and therefore, hopefully, to make you question what is going on in the world outside the gallery space. It was there to provoke, not to please or flatter in that manner. Desire infused the Surrealist poetry because, again, we must remember it began as a literary movement in 1924. It began playing with parodying a lot of genres of poetry and literature, and it then began to quickly infiltrate their art, their group exhibitions, and also the manifestos. Because as an avant-garde movement, the Surrealists also always expressed themselves in tracts, in manifestos, where they made specific social and political statements about art and its function in society. The Surrealists found desire in the everyday, in the banal, in the grime and the sweat of the city and modern life. The Surrealist poet Louis Aragon's Anarchy ou le Panorama of 1921 and his Paysan de Paris, Paris Peasant of 1926, are two novels which bridge the launch of the movement in 1924. And in both, Aragon turns to the streets and arcades of Paris, of the everyday and the now, to find amorous myths of old and new. From shop fronts, then, to little stores, to the huge dynamic department stores, we find that desire infiltrates the streets of Paris. And Jean Chypre, in the novel Anarchy, one of the ones I mentioned by Aragon, published in 1921, walks Paris with what he calls his, quote, magic kit, a complete world transfigurator kit, end of quote, which is so powerful, he tells the reader, that everything is offered to my desire. So you also have this kind of new male, almost, protagonist emerging in Surrealist literature and art. This idea of the flaneur, the wanderer who's walking the streets of Paris, pursuing chance encounters with the femme fatale of his dreams, but also finding stimulation in every corner that he turns. Hence, I've put up this postcard of Place Clichy from 1925 to, if you like, remind you of the fact that the whole visual culture of Paris, for the artist, but also for the everyday member of the public walking the streets of Paris, was radically new and radically visual, because advertising had taken over, if you like, billboards, shop front windows and department stores. And therefore, low art, as we traditionally call it, popular imagery, advertising, was seeping into visual culture and posing very serious challenges to high art culture, the visual imagery people saw within galleries and exhibition spaces. Eugene Atget was seen as sort of a precursor of the Surrealists and very much embraced by them in the 1920s, very influential for someone like Man Ray. Again, was someone who was taking photographs of the streets of Paris and documenting as a result this changing face of the streets of Paris. Here, this image of corsets from a shop specializing in it was reproduced again in Surrealist periodicals in the 1920s, where the Surrealists were trying to show how desire was actually seeping through the everyday and, as a result, influencing them. The real streets of Paris were illuminated for Aragon's fictional character, Chypre, by what he called the halos of shop windows and women. He talks about walking the streets looking for love's holy grail, and therefore you have the idea of desire and Paris becoming inseparable. Desire spills out into the city and the suburbs in Robert Desnos' novel Liberty or Love of 1927 too, and in this novel, a bébé cadum, the Pears soap equivalent in Paris advertising. Again, this is taken literally, a snapshot from Paris in 1924. This fantastic happy little baby in this novel, Liberty or Love, jumps off the billboard and becomes real in the plot, and is chased through the city of Paris by this big Michelin man who stepped down out of another advertising campaign. And this again gives you an idea of how the Surrealists, as I say, literally engage with the everyday. But of course the heroine of Liberty or Love is the poor woman by the name of Louise Lamb, who runs naked through the streets of Paris under the Arc de Triomphe, very much mapping out the city of Paris, and who ends up in the animalistic woods of the Bois de Boulogne in the suburbs. So the map of Paris and the idea of Paris as a place of desire is all important. Desire not only dominates surrealism then from the outset, both in literature, where it began, but also in the visual culture and in the paintings that begin to emerge from the mid-1920s on. And as I hope you'll have gleaned, it takes on an emphatically gendered form, an emphatically feminized form. Woman is of paramount importance to how they're looking at the world. Desire emanates from slim shop mannequins. The Surrealists become obsessed with the pertness of shop mannequins, female shop mannequins. They're obsessed with glamorous lady shoppers who become a whole new facet of society. Once women did all their shopping in catalogues at the turn of the 19th century. By the 1920s, the department store is dominated by women, and the exchanges between women, the exchanges between the men selling them the works, etc., introduces a whole new dynamism amongst strangers that they're fascinated by. And of course, they're forever pursuing blonde bob strangers walking through the streets of Paris, as we see in André Breton's novel Naja, published in 1928, devoted to the stranger called just Naja. The Surrealist perspective on the world allowed chance, the store purchase, the banal item of furniture even, to metamorphose into an erotic encounter. So as I say, everything you literally touched had a potential for desire. The Surrealist notion of desire turned a stool, as you see here on the left, such that it grew pink-stockinged feet. This is Kurt Seligman's Ultra Furniture, the stool that one can sit at here at the 1938 Surrealist exhibition. And unfortunately, we only have black and white photos, but these should have been fantastic pink-stockinged flapper feet. And of course, perhaps better known to you, an example on the right by Salvador Dali, done with Edward James, of Mae West's Lips sofa from 1938. Again, making literal, if you like, the potential of the sofa for a desirous encounter. And as I say, feminizing throughout, which is important. Desire's essential flame which keeps surrealism burning was a weapon then, also, which immediately drew woman into all things when it came to the surrealist universe. Emerging from a post-World War I state of disillusionment, but also society that had no choice but to liberate women for the purpose of war relief, the surrealists were perhaps the first generation of modern artists who had to negotiate femininity. They also had to negotiate masculinity, but we'll come to that in a moment. But they had to negotiate woman's new changing role and the notion of the feminine, the good, the bad, the different female type, in this their obsession with desire. So society posed that challenge to them in any case, but because they were so obsessed with the theme of love and desire, of course they couldn't avoid it. In the art of male surrealists, woman thus looms large and takes on many guises, from passive to active lover, from femme enfant to femme fatale. And the femme enfant is this idea of the child woman, an enchanting creature who's a Lolita-like figure on the cusp of womanhood, still, if you like, unrepressed in terms of taboo and what it is to be a good or bad woman. And most importantly for the surrealists, a child woman is someone who has a direct connection in their mind to the unconscious, to nature, to the kind of primordial. However, she takes on many guises, from Salvador Dali's Imperial monument to the child woman, who's very much a woman, here in 1929, who seems to be sort of passively loitering, and yet who is overshadowed or overseen by this vicious lion figure, who's Dali's symbol of desire. Everywhere you get this lion icon. To Hans Bellmer is perhaps more disturbing, definitely because of her prepubescent state, Doll, from 1938, who was first born in 1933 in his body of work, and where you have these bizarre female doll-like limbs turned monstrous in his photographs, and then staged again in an almost Bois de Boulogne, the woods scenario, where Jack the Ripper might pounce on her, where she might be engaging in erotic games, and most disturbingly, I suppose, for us looking at it, where Belmer insists that young girls have many erotic and sexual fantasies, and therefore he's, if you like, giving free rein to them. So from, if you like, again, a kind of illusionistic metamorphosis on the left of Dali to these bizarre photographs on the right with Belmer, we find the female from girlhood to womanhood dominating the canon of surrealism, male surrealists. And we also find that there's also a kind of castrating female type. This idea that woman is, on the one hand, the object of desire, on the other hand, the fact that she has the power to castrate men, to threaten them, as explored in a series of photographs by Man Ray called Anatomies of 1929, where he abstracts the female form, in this case an almost orgasmic female form, such that she morphs into a phallic photograph. And again, this is a work which has been interpreted as exploring the idea of woman as fatal, as a woman of femme fatale. But obviously using again the medium photography, a new medium, in a way which definitely shocks, which makes people uncomfortable, which makes people have to look at things over and over again, and at that often through blinkered eyes. These representations of woman as the path to the marvellous, as the path to desire and the unconscious, to the holy grail of love, as they say, of course, has provoked people. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that people, including Rudolph Kensley, in his essay on surrealism and misogyny, in a collection on surrealism and women, published in 1991, would argue, influentially, quote, male surrealists did not see woman as a subject, but as a projection, an object of their own dreams of femininity. Or that he would go on to argue that these masculine dreams play an active part in patriarchy's misogynistic positioning of women. End of quote. So that's from a 1991 collection called Surrealism and Women. But as I say, there has been a series of interpretations of these types of work, which have very much led art historians to believe that surrealism was inherently misogynistic. It was sexist. It was objectifying women and parading them in a manner which is shocking at best, but at worst only contributing to the domination of women in society. However, to my mind, to read these works, these male surrealist works, and also then to juxtapose them with female surrealist work, with this kind of mentality, is to negate the dynamics of male and female desire in surrealism. It's to accept the role of society in civilizing desire and prescribing roles for women which reduce them to mother or whore, the good or the bad female imago. It's also to negate the male surrealists' battle with issues of masculinity as well as femininity in the interwar period, and male surrealists' rejection, most importantly, of traditional male roles, the role of soldier, the role of provider, the role of moral arbiter, as well as their self-conscious dialogue, if you like, their self-conscious challenge to the long tradition of the female nude in Western art. Hence, you look at Man Ray, you've got to look at all of Man Ray's work, and even when he does an image of his lover, Kiki de Montparnasse, who was a popular male model for male artists. But when he does do this fantastic photo montage where he imprints the curlews of a violin onto the back of her nude body, it is to appreciate this, as anybody in 1924 Paris would, is to realise that long tradition of the male nude which preceded it. In fact, this is a mockery to a certain extent of Ang and his famous, much respected Academy images of the female nude, loitering in this case in a harem in the Turkish bath of 1862. It's to play on the idea that woman herself can be erotically played upon, but also this idea that there's a long tradition of objectifying and making the female passive, an object of desire. To a certain extent, obviously people like Kiki de Montparnasse, who became an artist in her own right, were also enjoying this mockery of the male tradition, and the fact that women artists were drawn to these artists, these male artists, producing these works which parodied a long tradition, the holy grail itself of art, cannot go unrecognised. Today I want to impress upon you the importance of what I'm calling surrealism's politics of eros, and how the surrealist stance on erotic desire, or the life drive, otherwise known as eros, underpins male and female artists' exploration of the desiring body, and the potential role of using desire to better society. So in other words, I'm want you to, if you like, put aside the initial idea that perhaps these are objectifying women and see them more as works which deliberately provoke you out of a passive way of looking at art, out of a way of saying that doesn't please me or that does, and question more what was the aim of this reassessment, reevaluation, and reprojection of the theme of desire. As Louis Aragon proclaimed in 1930, Sigmund Freud focused the scandalous eyes of sexuality on the incomprehensible, and it was to Freud that we must turn, as the Surrealists turned, for the psychological impact of the theme of desire, the psychological politics, if you like, of the very act of viewing. It was from Sigmund Freud that the Surrealists took their understanding of eros, the life drive, though they took it much further than he advocated. Freud's connection between dream and, all importantly, repressed desire was seminal to the Surrealist faith in the power of art to liberate the individual. Freud wrote of art as an activity which is liberated from reality and which, as a result, could liberate repressed instincts. In other words, when you dream, there's nobody looking over you, there's nobody watching you. You can dream and desire as you want and as you will. This was the power of dream, and obviously for the psychoanalyst, why one puts somebody on the couch and asks them to discuss all that has been unleashed and all that which is difficult to comprehend in dream. But he also said that art was linked to dream in this manner because it was also liberated from good taste, good society, and therefore it could also reveal things that had been repressed. Now for Freud, taboo, desire, should be repressed for the good of society. Otherwise, every incestuous wish would be pursued and we would live in moral chaos, but also sexual chaos. The Surrealists took Freud's writing, but ran with them. They did not believe that all these things should be repressed for the name of civilization. Rather, they thought we should think about what we repress and why we repress them, and how we can change the face of so-called civilization en route. They thought that we should seize desire as a means of liberation, as a means of questioning society and the power hierarchies which control it. Now, this is just a small science bit. It's only a tiny mention. I'll move on in a moment. But in his 1923 essay, The Ego and the Id, which was translated and used by the Surrealists in France in 1927, translated into French in 1927, the id is the source of eros and is guided by the pleasure principle. And for Freud, eros is about the union between the human and the object world. Eros is understood as excessive desire, however, and in psychoanalytic terms, because it's linked to the pleasure principle, it is something that needs to be controlled. Anybody who, as I say, overindulges in it needs therapy to kind of expend it and to solve their problems. The Surrealists chose to unleash desire for subversive aesthetic and social political ends, using this idea of eros as something which we all share, but which society encourages us to repress. For them, the Surrealists, they said we should all learn to look at the world, think about the world, through the eyes of eros, as Breton once stated in 1944. So rather than repress eros for the name of civilization, let's repress civilization and all its warring tendencies, which hadn't got it far between World War I and World War II, and follow eros, a much nicer, much happier life drive. And it's also a life drive which in the 1960s was returned to by a lot of left-wing artists and thinkers. The question for us when we deal with eros, when we think about these male surrealist art, is how could women artists, women who join the surrealist movement, negotiate the male surrealist approach to the theme of erotic desire, Freud's ideas of eros, and the potential for them, if you like, taking this theme of eros and erotic desire and turning it to their own personal and political ends. And this is something that I've been exploring for a while and obsessing about the theme of eros. But essentially, the male and the female surrealists seized eros and unleashed it in their art in the hope that it would unleash desire in civilized society, and woman was all important a sign and symbol of desire and eros. Hence, she is the protagonist of so many works by both the male and the female artist's work. And hence this idea, as I say, that she is the path not just to the marvellous, but perhaps to eros, the kind of goddess, the leader of the way in that sense, which elevates woman not just to an object of desire for surrealism, but actually gives her much more power than people who immediately dismiss it as misogynistic might realise. Most women artists became involved in Surrealism after the 1936 International Surrealist Exhibition. However, they were involved in Surrealism from the start, including Simone Kahn, Breton's first wife, including Gala, who was Dali's femme enfant, femme fatale figure, and occurs as his female archetype in many of his paintings, and including people like the Czech surrealist Mary Toyen, who features upstairs in the show too, who, as you can see from the image on the right, has a fantastically naughty sense of humour. Young Girl Who Dreams of 1930 again indicated that the women surrealists from the outset had no problem exploring erotic desire and taboo. If anything, they ran with it and used it very much to slap the face of society, their families, and very much the roles that they chose to reject, including marriage, motherhood, marriage and motherhood. It's been suggested by the feminist writer Gloria Orenstein in an essay of 1973 that women surrealists dialogued with their male counterparts, offering an active and passive, dominant and muted voice, and that that's how we should look at women, as if you like the quiet voice compared to that male desiring voice. However, I think, as you see from this example and the ones we look at, this is far from the case. If anything, a lot of the female surrealists outshone their male counterparts when it came to the theme of desire. They pushed it to its limits, often challenging their male lovers, their male counterparts, and André Breton himself, who, in fact, if you read letters and interviews, was rather conservative when it came to the role of women in society, men and women, and who always remained faithful to the institution of marriage, for example. He was not a brothel-going member of the Surrealist group, as many of his colleagues were. However, it's true that the two main things we, if you like, need to keep in mind when we do look at women surrealists is that when it came to Freud, they found him problematic. Freud, who famously described woman as a dark continent, and when speaking to women in a lecture on femininity said, to those of you who are women, this will not apply, because woman, you are yourself the problem when it comes to most psychoanalytic dialogues. He basically managed to erase woman from most of his writings on psychoanalysis. However, the Freudian fetish, as we'll see, was of paramount importance to so many of the women surrealists that it's clear that they took Freud's writings and, as I say, ran with it much further than a lot of their male counterparts, taking the fact that the fetish was associated with castration and female power. And they also turned to the writings of Freud's disciple, Carl Jung, whose dates are 1875 to 1961, because his psychoanalytic writings offered much more to women. Why? Because his writings engaged in myth, religion, astrology, alchemy, but more importantly, he wrote about what you may have heard of as the animus and the anima. He wrote about woman in man and man in woman. And he wrote about an ideal condition in which the male and female principles are balanced out. Jung argued that we find these male and female principles in each individual. And this was something that appealed, unsurprisingly, to women surrealists because it gave them parity, equality in many ways, and it particularly appealed to Leonor, Fini. Fini was once described by Julian Levy, and the descriptions of so many of the surrealists, women surrealists, shows that they were kind of, they were personas, they were kind of these dramatic figures. Definitely Fini was. She was notorious for sort of walking into a cafe dressed in a bishop's robes and no underwear underneath. She was very theatrical, and again, I think it's important to keep in mind because these were women who very much tried to break down the traditional roles and boxes that had been ascribed to women generally. They're part of not just the sort of flapper generation of the 1920s, but they're women who are really trying to redesign the whole role of women in society and then seizing art as a fantastic way to do so. She was described by Julian Levy, who's the man who set up a huge surrealist a gallery in New York and was very influential, as not a beautiful woman. Her parts did not fit well together: head of a lioness, mind of a man, bust of a woman, torso of a child, grace of an angel, and discourse of the devil. She definitely had a dirty tongue, they claim. Her lure was an ability to dominate her misfitted parts so that they merged into whatever shape her fantasy wished. To a certain extent, she's often deemed a relatively marginal figure in Surrealism. However, this is again not really true. She was involved in the Surrealists from the early 1930s. She exhibited with them in 1933, in 1936, in 1947. She had an affair with Max Ernst, but then most women surrealists did. She was friendly with Dali, she was friendly with his wife Gala, she was friendly with Paul Eluard, who wrote essays about her art and celebrated them. She once stated, and again this is where we're kind of trying to negotiate their roles, she said, "It was encouraging to be amongst other artists, but I disliked the deference with which everyone treated Breton, and I hated his misogyny. It seemed that the women were expected to keep quiet in cafe discussions, yet I felt I was just as good as the men." Now again, this is where, to a certain extent, a lot of interviews and dialogues that are carried out with women surrealists pose a problem for us art historians, because the word misogyny crops up, but more so because we find certain women surrealists took issue with Breton, with André Breton, the so-called leader of the movement, finding him, if you like, too large a figure to negotiate with. But when it comes to surrealism, as an ism, as a movement and a way of creating, they did not have that problem. Equally, Fini was one of the women who, in Whitney Chadwick's book on women surrealists, was very vocal in insisting that she did not want to be part of a book devoted only to women surrealists. And any women surrealists I've ever met have always said this, that you cannot say male surrealist and female surrealist. Sorry, Patricia, but in terms of the show, it sort of, again, is something that's pointed about it. But what they said was it was surrealism. International, non-gender specific, non-sexual specific. They did not want it to be something about a battle of the sexes, because the whole point and spirit of surrealism was that to get over that hierarchy. It was about bringing opposites, and men and females are traditionally seen as opposites, together, and that's what's important. So we have to kind of, if you like, nuance or negotiate with these statements that they make. What's curious about Fini is that in her images then of woman, we find they take on this leonine, this sort of goddess-like theatrical form, very much a part of her own self-portraiture. But also, as you can see, the men are pale and sickly loitering. They're these kind of passive objects, often there as kind of playthings for the women. Much like that earlier toy-in where you have these little penises flying around like little butterflies or something in her dreams. You have this idea that they're very much not emasculating men, but just talking about them as erotic objects of desire. They're playthings too, which is reversing traditional roles when it comes to male and female desire. We also find that in Fini, the Sphinx comes to the foreground in terms of her iconography and how she represents woman. She turns to the Greek mythology of the Sphinx, the idea of the riddle of the Sphinx, the idea that the Sphinx is the predator and the person of Oedipus whose challenge Oedipus has to face. And here, as you see in 1948, in this one of many, many images, she begins doing images of the Sphinx in 1942 to 44, and they continue to dominate her out. And this is upstairs, it's from the Tate collection. It's exquisite to watch, to look at. A fantastic hard-edge oil technique and a beautifully intimate composition. But as you see, you have this, at first, sort of rather benign, rather pretty little girl who's a little Sphinx. But as you can see just about, you will definitely see when you see her in flesh upstairs, she actually is sort of almost licking her lips or wiping down her paws as a cat will do after having had its prey. And the occultist details about in the front, this is the idea that there's an old hip bone, a triangle, broken bones, all suggest that the Sphinx has just actually had her prey, and her prey would have been, again, probably a young, brave male trying to solve the riddle of the Sphinx. So she's guarding the entrance, perhaps, to an old room. There's an idea that, as I say, these are the kind of traces, perhaps, of a recent victim. Are these men trying to solve the riddle of the Sphinx? But largely, in these sort of portrayal of woman as either sort of priestess with this flaming hair, or as Sphinx, we find that Fini flaunts femininity. She flaunts the Freudian power of femininity, to reclaim power for the female, but also to unsettle the traditional male viewer looking at it, who's pondering over how they're meant to, if you like, dialogue with what they see. We have this idea then that she's giving you an alternative iconography of the female body, something which, as I say, disturbs, but makes you question how woman has been portrayed in the long tradition of Western art. And there's very much an ongoing dialogue with the long tradition of Western art, because these are fantastically well-educated, well-read artists that we're dealing with too with surrealism, which and quite privileged in terms of aristocratic background. The Swiss artist Merit Oppenheim was also very influenced by psychoanalysis and by Freud. Her father was a friend of Jung, and she's someone who turns again to traditional roles of woman, but in a radically different way, often using the object. Now, her objects wreaked havoc on the genre of, on the idea of the still life, but also on the idea of the male gaze, because again, they're more like sort of conundrums, puzzles that you've got to unpack. They're not works of art that you can easily look at. On the left, I've just included one of a series of shots that Man Ray took of her in 1933 called Erotic Veils, where you see her, if you like, staged beside a large printing press. And these again, I think, is indicative. I think she was about 20 or 22 when she did these series of images, when she, with Man Ray, who she described as the master and herself as the muse. But clearly, when you see actually the whole sort of series of photographs taken, she's someone that's also kind of thinking through what she's doing, thinking through her self-image, having greased her hair back such that she looks very boyish. She's comfortable in her own nakedness, and she's someone who's smearing paint on herself in such a way that she becomes quite symbolic of the primitive. Others have said that this could be a reference to St. Catherine's torture wheel. People have said that this is a suggestion here that Maria Coles argues this might be seen as a kind of phallic rape of the female. But actually, again, in dialogues with Merit Oppenheim, we find that there isn't quite that level of violence and antagonism. There's more sense of collaboration, and people producing works which are meant to provoke you into wondering what it's about, but also who is taking the photo, who is meant to be looking at it, and what was her role in the scenario. Her object, Breakfast in Fur of 1936, is one of the most famous Surrealist objects ever, now in the collection of MoMA in New York. It was one of the first Surrealist objects purchased by Alfred Barr, who came over to see the show. And again, the fact that it was by a woman Surrealist isn't important for its own sake, but is important in the sense that it put Oppenheim on the Surrealist map very quickly. In fact, it's a work which she was almost haunted by for the rest of her long life and career. It is an object which again turns that domestic object, that everyday object that you can purchase in a supermarket, into something monstrous and surrealist. It's something that exploits the notion of fetish, in particular Freud's writings about certain textures, materials, as having an association with the female maternal sex. For him, velvet and fur in particular could be associated with the female, and more so the taboo of the mother and her actual sex, and the idea that this was forbidden to the young boy. The story about this work, of course, is quite famous. You have the idea that Merit Oppenheim is sitting in a cafe with Pablo Picasso and his then lover, the surrealist Dora Maar, who's also included in the show upstairs. And when they were having their coffee, the waiter asked Merit Oppenheim if she would like a little top-up of coffee, and she said, yes, a little more fur, please. They laughed about this, and because she was also wearing a bangle, which she herself had covered in fur, because she created costume jewellery in that manner, she began talking with them about the fact that one could actually cover anything in fur and translate the everyday banal thing, the pen, the cup, the bangle, into something which took on a peculiar difference, into something surreal. Hence this Monoprix cup, saucer and spoon, purchased in a department store, as anybody can, is transformed into something banal, something which actually through the addition of fur negates its very function, because it has far from the usual function of being a vessel for liquid, and now suggests again this idea of being a sexual vessel. It suggests the idea, again, drawing very much on Freud's writings, that the mother is the maternal breast, she is a vessel of nourishment, plays at that, and it plays also on the repulsiveness of actually drinking from something in fur. So you have again this idea, I suppose, that the women were, if anything, as I say, pushing the boundaries of desire in this manner. Her domestic objects then also leave the domestic space of the home, the parlour, women sharing coffee. They play on the idea that the cafe was a new space for women, and very much the flapper generation in the 1920s and 30s, where people and artists and self-minded intellectuals could come together. And they also make the personal somewhat political. This is certainly the case when we look at a work like My Nurse of 1936, in which, again, banal everyday objects play on traditional roles of women and bring them into a surrealist arena. In this case, we have a pair of white high heels trussed up to look like a Sunday roast on a silver platter. It's a work which, again, suggests the kind of hijacking of the everyday, of something that a woman might find in her wardrobe, and turning it into something which makes you think both about the Sunday roast and about woman being tied up, bound by her traditional social roles, and her sexual roles, and the male fantasy which might be such that she be trussed up in that manner. It looks to Aragon's Paris Peasant, it looks to those other surrealist objects, and very much surrealist novels, in playing with this idea that you can look at the world through surrealist eyes. However, what's also important about this work is that actually it has a sort of personal punch, if you like, because these white discarded heels are actually the white high heels of Max Ernst, the painter, specifically his wife, Marie Berth, and he gave Merit Oppenheim this pair of white high heels that his wife had discarded. But as a result, it also alluded to the fact that Oppenheim herself had a year-long affair with Max Ernst in 1934. So it was a little sort of self-portrait about a ménage à trois to a certain extent, produced in 1936. And famously, apparently, when Marie Berth came to the 1936 exhibition of objects that the Surrealists organised, the Charles Raton Gallery in Paris that year, she was furious, because this was like, again, rubbing salt in the wounds. But again, this is where there were sort of layers of meaning about it. She's wearing the shoes of somebody else, the woman who, unbeknownst to herself, was upstaged by a younger, glamorous woman who came in and had her way with many men. And there's, as I say, also a kind of hijacking of the male surrealist idea of the object and Freudian connotations of it. Now, the next slide that you can see is a kind of self-portrait, which you see from 1940 on the left of Frida Kahlo, and on the right a self-portrait with cropped hair, also of 1940. And I move on to Mexico in the case of Frida Kahlo briefly, just to again suggest the idea of the personal, and how the personal was used by many women surrealists as they, if you like, hijacked male surrealist language, and specifically the writings of Sigmund Freud. Now, by 1940, Frida Kahlo, although she always had a kind of difficulty in admitting that she was a surrealist, but by 1940 she had met André Breton when he came to Mexico in 1938. She had exhibited in Paris in 1939, and in 1940 was part of an international surrealist exhibition in Mexico City too. So to say she wasn't a surrealist is really to deny her her place in the canon of art, whatever about her own worries, if you like, about André Breton himself. She's a woman whose husband, the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera, much better known to her initially, but by now actually perhaps overshadowed by his formidable wife. But he claims she's the only example in the history of art of an artist who tore open her chest and heart to reveal the biological truth of her feelings. And this is a useful quote because it also does remind us of the importance of the personal and how women surrealists introduce the personal to their narratives of desire and eroticism and surrealism. Where the male surrealists often projected sort of abstract desires, we definitely find the female surrealists negotiating their own actual everyday experiences, often through the self-portrait, in their body of work. In the case of Frida Kahlo, we often witness the body in physical and psychological pain. Again, we are presented with works which disturb us, which are far often from seductive, and which are intended to move you out of any kind of passive state of viewing, of experiencing art, and in particular when you're looking at woman. Kahlo portrays herself as both a human subject, as somebody who has a mind and emotions that she's working through almost, and often as a kind of iconic object, as she abstracts herself into this icon of strong woman, with often her pets, as in her pet monkey here, or with often drawing on Catholic imagery, often drawing on images of crucifixion, thorns, or in this case a ribbon, which seems to again wrap her, but perhaps strangle her, and that's a kind of motif coming across over and over. As you see on the right, she's also someone who engages with that idea of the materialist fetish, because a moment ago I showed you Oppenheim's cup and saucer covered in fur. Fur, velvet, in this case hair, are all things that we often associate with the nude, with the female body in repose, and the all-alluring female body. Here, what has she done except cut off this fantastic tresses of hair that she has? She's hacked them off. She did this literally in real life. She documented it, noted it in her diary, and portrayed it as she always did at any moment, significant moment in her life, in a self-portrait. In this self-portrait of the cropped hair of 1940, it's a response to that man Diego Rivera, who I mentioned, the large Mexican muralist whom she married, and the fact that he had an affair with her beloved sister, Christina, which he discovered, which he learnt about in early 1940, and which she then documented or purged herself of in this self-portrait. She cuts off these locks, not just because it's sort of a way of almost self-castrating or masochistically shearing off this hair, which is a symbol of her strength and her femininity, but also because Rivera himself had often referred to publicly and privately her hair and how much he adored it. And as you can see in the image, she also shows the hair as kind of almost taking on a life form of its own, as if it's beginning to metamorphose into all these labyrinthine little creatures who are running away from her and taking revenge. She wears a suit. Normally she wears a fantastic Tijuana costume, traditional Mexican Aztec costume. Here she's wearing a suit which is far too large for her, and a suit which was often donned by her husband. So she's masculinized herself. She's turned herself into this kind of masculine other. And as other critics have noted, she still yields the scissors, as if we're not sure what the next snip is going to be. So there's also an element still of self-empowerment to it. She's cut off the hair, she's holding the scissors dangerously close to her sex, but because she's wearing a male, probably her husband's, suit, as I say, there's also an element of threat, a warning, if you like, a dialogue, not just with the male who's wondering how he's meant to read it, or you, the viewer, looking at it, but specifically it's a message to Diego. Also, she includes the lyrics of a popular Mexican song, again drawing in low culture to high culture, a popular advertising song on the top of the image. It says, "Look, if I loved you, it was because of your hair. Now that you are without hair, I don't love you anymore." So there's a black humor, and a fantastic sense of black humor really does dominate a lot of the women surrealist art that you've got to run with. Now this image too reminds us of the negotiation then of sexual and gender identity in women surrealist art, the fact that they're dealing with themselves through the self-portrait, they're dealing with themselves as the lover, often of a male artist, they're dealing with themselves as the muse, often for male artists, and how they don't just want to be the model for themselves in their art, but they want to be the master of their own image in a way that usually is only allowed for the male artist, to master the self, to master the image. And as a result, you might compare Kahlo's self-portrait to Masculine and Feminine, one of my favourite objects that I would like to steal, by the Canadian artist Mimi Parron. Again, someone who's only come to the kind of notice of critics in the past decade, really, but a fantastically exciting artist and a woman too, who only died in 2005. But this is another object where we find hair. We find a fetishistic material, something that, you know, men are writing about, golden hair in the sun, and here turned into a kind of a trophy, turned into something distinctly male, a tie. And what's even more interesting is that this work, when it was produced in 1959 and set against a white shirt and tie and a black dinner jacket again, you know, quintessentially male monkey suit garb. But the interesting thing is it's not just hair, the idea that a tie is morphing, coming alive, if you like, or the suggestion of body hair, the suggestion that this man is desiring the hair of the woman he's standing with. I mean, there's a whole suggestiveness going on, but it's actually Mimi's own hair. It's hair that she has cut off herself. She always had hair, very long hair that she plaited. So there's something personal going on. Now, Jean Benoit, her husband, whom she left Canada, Montreal, with in 1947 to move to Paris, he always claimed to me in interviews that he and Mimi had one of their many kind of fights, I suppose you call it, and he always liked to pretend he's someone who was having affairs with anything that moved, and to a certain extent also argued that this was where they had such a feud that she chopped off her hair, sort of took her pigtail, as you only see done in drastic makeovers, and chopped off this plait and discarded it as a way of saying, there you go, one of the things, much like Kahlo, that you most love me for was my hair, and there it is. she disputed this, saying this would make the work about Jean Benoit, understandably not about her. But what's interesting is, again, it has become iconic. It is a work that has influenced many subsequent generations of feminist artists who have also used the sign and symbol, the motif, the Freudian symbolic value, if you like, of woman's hair as a way, again, of challenging us about our expectations when it comes to sexuality and how we describe female sexuality and control it. The kind of, if you like, symbols that note or allow us to understand whether somebody is good, bad, or indifferent in paintings up until now. This was also a work which fantastically appealed to André Breton, the leader of the movement, right up until 1959, right up until his death in 1966 in Paris. So much so that he chose it for an unknown artist, really, for the poster for his new international exhibition devoted specifically to the theme of Eros in 1959. So that, again, he seized on this woman who had done something to his mind which was fantastically exciting, and used it to promote the 1959 Eros exhibition in a way which, again, seems to my mind to counteract any idea that he was misogynistic, that the male surrealists had no time for the women, that they only objectify them. He also encouraged Mimi to design the catalogue for the actual show, which he did with Marcel Duchamp. And for decades and decades, this is also a catalogue which was only ever attributed to Marcel Duchamp because he's much better known and therefore gains much more value on the marketplace. But it was a catalogue, again, which is called Boîte aux Lettres, and which punned on the idea of a letterbox and the idea that you could post little ideas into it, little desires, and take little desires out of it. If you actually open the catalogue, and there's one in the Tate collection in London, you find that, again, it was playing with notions of censorship, of good taste, of value, even in 1959 when it came to eroticism, which was the theme of the show, because it included little erotic ditties, it included love songs on records, it included short stories, and it included a letter with whole sections blackened out, supposedly by the censor. So the element of politics and freedom of speech and the freedom of the individual to express their desires in 1959 on the cusp of the 60s was all important still in this later decade of the movement. Parhon also designed a fetish room for this Eros exhibition, a fantastic, exciting exhibition, or at least I think so, which was entered by the member of the public, by you. So you would walk in through these kind of big pink doors, over which you would have found a Belmer doll hanging, so you'd look up and find a naked young girl hanging there. The floors were covered in sand, and the whole interior of it was designed so that you felt you're actually entering into a body. The wall side, orgasmically, because someone had recorded, Radovan Isvik had recorded two actresses playing out this orgasmic sign. And this was played. Also the sound of taxis, so the idea that you were kind of moving into a boudoir. Very much people felt very threatened by this. It's important to say this wasn't sort of seen as a prank. People realised that on entering, they had to meander through this labyrinth of rooms to exit. And therefore a lot of people felt hot, uncomfortable, nervous, particularly as you can imagine with so many people. And they had lined the walls again with velvet, green velvet, black velvet, all by Mimi Parhon. Their main problem, in fact, was the fact that this posed a very serious fire hazard. Because presumably this is the time when people are all smoking their gitans and stuff walking through as well, so I don't know. Interestingly, the last room of the 1959 Eros exhibition, so a whole international exhibition which won international acclaim devoted to Eros, was again by a woman, by that same woman who designed that object, Breakfast in Fur, Mary Oppenheim, who installed this cannibal feast on a naked artist model, painted in gold, spread out like a big sort of exotic dinner, covered in exotic food and fruits. She had champagne, glasses filled with champagne around her. She had a lobster between her thighs, as you can see, grapes. And members of the public were again encouraged to sit down around her and feast on her in this manner. It was a banquet for the eyes, a banquet for taste buds, but also, importantly, a banquet for the imagination. And you have this idea that, again, women were using the female body, the notion of desire, the idea of some kind of entrapment and dialogue, as a way of provoking people into thinking, very radically so for Oppenheim, who was very feminist in her art and life, to think about eros and desire and how it might make us better individuals, but also change society. In clothing the naked female form and food, Oppenheim could be seen to display what Laura Mulvey, the feminist writer, has called a sexuality of surface, where sexuality displaces a deep-seated anxiety about the female body. In other words, by exploiting, if you like, the eroticism, the sexuality of the female body in this hyper way in the exhibition, you have the idea that the deep-seated anxiety people and society have about female sexuality, and female sexuality being put to any use other than the maternal use, was being, as I say, flaunted in this manner. Oppenheim, like Mimi Perron, like Frida Kahlo, like Leonor Fini, might be seen to turn to erotic desire and eros itself as a kind of armor, as a way of armoring the female body, armoring the woman artist in society, turning to erotic desire and eros itself as a way of defending themselves against the taboo of the body, the idea that the body must be nude and passive, and, if you like, activating the feminine in a different way so that it assaults patriarchy and you get a proto-feminism coming to the fore. It's a way of making the personal political, it's a way of seizing the body and celebrating it in all its taboos, as I say, not just in the sense of the maternal or the wife or the whore and those old categories, but actually showing women taking control of their own bodies, their own sexuality, which is again why it was so radically important, not just for the 60s, but obviously the post-68 generation of feminist artists. This mode of sexuality is not dependent on the male viewer. It doesn't flatter the male viewer. It actually allows women to look at women, and it has women, as I say, having a kind of sense of erotic fun with their own bodies. It's conscious of the superficial role of woman as the object of the male gaze in a long tradition of art, but it uses the fetishistic trappings of the feminine to subvert society's use of taboo to restrict woman. That's to say that this work, Spring Banquet, similar to the other works we've looked at, stage what you might describe as a kind of double entendre. On the one hand, woman is exposed as a fantastic titillating object of desire, but on the other hand, just through this very explicit celebration of woman as all things desirable, indicated that the male viewer, predominantly the male viewer, was made self-conscious, was almost mocked or challenged in a manner which made them so self-conscious that again the whole dynamics of desire between men and women, those in power and those without power, were confronted, challenged and questioned. There's an interaction and a dialogue, and the idea that you, the viewer, still have to complete the work of art as you try and unravel it, reread it, look at it over and over and wonder what the politics are going on in it, and whether or not you would have automatically known that this was by a woman artist, I doubt it, or whether you'd have presumed this is yet another example of men enjoying women's bodies for their own sake and treating them as just another object to be devoured. These women artists insisted on the collaborative nature of desire. They denied any notion that woman is subservient, and they insisted on the subversive potential of desire to change and radicalize desire, or society in that manner. They advanced, as a result, André Breton's 1944 call to embrace eros, when he said we must all learn to read with and look through the eyes of eros in 1944, when he said again just before the end of war that it's about time to look to woman for answers, obviously at a time when war had only shown how men could do nothing right really in society. And to my mind, you get the ultimate lesson in looking at women artists and this idea of how they used eros, is that they, as I say, took a theme of desire even further, revolutionizing it in a way which then paved the way for real radical feminists who call themselves such in the 1960s and later, through a dynamic and often audacious engagement with their own body as a desiring body, with the desired female body, with the fetish body part, with the hair or the trappings of the female body, with woman almost as still life, and woman as femme fatale. These women artists contest the passive role and representation of women in society and insert the potential of the avant-garde of art itself to lead society in new radical ways. So they want to change mentalities through their art practice. And it's important to note that it's only through these women that, as I say, later women could make such a quick, radical impact on the art canon. People like Caroline Schneemann, whose performance Meet Joy in Paris in 1964 and whose works from the late 1958 on were indebted to to this generation often of women surrealists, very much in the sense that it seemed to pave the way for women artists to enjoy their own bodies, to make the personal political and make sex political in a new radical way. This is a performance, as I say, which involved men and women, food, blood, guts, dance, and a lot of fun in Paris in 1964. It also included Caroline Schneemann's self and her lover at the time, putting her personal thing in the midst of it and challenging what we've seen to be acceptable in society and sexual practice, as well as art, and how this could be art. And indeed, as much as the YBA aren't exactly my first passion, it is also a way, I think, of appreciating a lot of the sort of bad contemporary art. And it's quite amusing to think that even sort of Britain's, lad or bad girl artist Sarah Lucas and her parody of Magritte's Rape in Two Fried Eggs and a Kebab of 1992, an installation where, as you can see, she actually kind of plays with René Magritte's famous, and again a work often interpreted as misogynistic, work of 1934, where desire is literally projected onto the female, as if we've just looked at a woman and immediately fantasized about having her, and where actually we're not looking at her face so much as the body we desire beneath it, is mocked out in her installation, where she says that basically she puns on his Magritte piece here, but also plays on this idea that even in contemporary society, 1992, I'm sure the same could be said, 2009, this idea that woman is no more than two fried eggs and kebab, a meal to be quickly devoured and had and spit out. She claims this is her way of slapping the face of laddish society, the Sun newspaper, the pin-up, and the idea that woman is still exploited in this manner. But in paying homage, or referencing at least, René Magritte's Rape, it again reminds us that his art, like all surrealist art, was itself, as I say, parodic of patriarchal and misogynistic representations of women, and it was there, yonks before the YBAs did it, to slap you in the face and say, think about politics as you think about art. Thank you.